This episode of Get Outta Here, the AP Travel Podcast, is sponsored by Carnival Corporation, the world's largest cruise company with 10 of the world's leading brands, including Carnival Cruise Line, Cunard, Holland America Line, Princess Cruises, and Seabourn. To learn about the world's leading cruise lines from Carnival Corporation and great vacation options, contact your travel professional or visit worldsleadingcruiselines.com.
It's Get Outta Here. I'm Warren Levinson. Green Book, the race relations buddy movie that won the Best Picture award at the Oscars this year, doesn't share much beyond a title with Victor Green's Guide, but it has made the guide, published by the New Jersey mail carrier from 1936 to 1967, a lot more well-known. New roads and affordable cars sent millions of people on road trips for the first time in the middle of the 20th century. But in legally segregated America, the road was full of traps for black travelers. Restaurants and hotels could legally refuse them service. Even getting a restroom could be a fraught experience. The Green Book, a listing of places where black travelers could expect to be welcomed, saved a lot of humiliation, and worse. The Green Book went out of business a few years after the Civil Rights Act became law in 1964, and a lot of the places it described eventually faded away. But in recent years, there's been a nascent movement to reclaim some of that history, a trend the AP's Russell Contreras wrote about recently from Albuquerque, New Mexico. We talked with him the other day about Green Book tourism. So, Russ Contreras, there are people who actually take Green Book tours, or is this still something that's really novel?
It's something that's really novel that started a few years ago prior to the movie Green Book. There had been some researchers looking into the legacy of Route 66 with black travelers. And so a number of scholars and travel experts and aficionados of Route 66 started to look and examine how black travelers navigated Route 66 back in the day. Because Route 66 has this novelty aspect to it. It's America's highway. But for black travelers, it could be really dangerous because it was so desolate. So a few years ago, there were a group of folks who started printing out green books and just taking tours about, and as part of their overall Route 66 trip or vacation, would try to find any of these sites, whether they were in Oklahoma, New Mexico, or California. And some of these buildings remain. A lot of them are gone. But since you could find the addresses, one could visit there and say, well, okay, well, here's a car wash. At one time, this was a site of a hotel or motel that was an oasis in the desert. And this provided protection for black travelers or any travelers of color, at least for that one night. So it became this thing that some aficionados started doing and posting online and sharing it with people.
So when the historians come through a location and tell the locals or tell the owner, this place used to be, sort of like a 20th century version of a stop on the Underground Railroad, are the owners surprised, or is it something they knew?
A lot of times they are surprised. When the Associated Press did our story on the Green Book, after the movie came out, the owner of the De Anza Motor Lodge in Albuquerque posted online this excitement that, look, our motel that is going through renovations was a site for black travelers that was in black travelers' guidebooks more than 50 years ago. I don't think that the owners or people in the development knew this story, but then, of course, they started bragging about it because this motel, particularly on Route 66 in the middle of Albuquerque, was such a mainstay and such an iconic place that it elevated their importance. The guy that ran this hotel for many years had an underground tunnel that had a Hopi mural on it. So it was like from 1947. So it elevated this place that this was really an oasis that invited all people of color. So regardless of the desolation you were going to face if you were going to travel from Chicago to L.A., at least at this one place was this multicultural gathering that you could have protection for one night and enjoy life, enjoy your trip, and feel safe.
So if you're driving from Chicago to L.A., we're talking like late 1940s when this is just becoming a thing. If you're black, you're still going to be going through sunset towns. You're going to be going through places where it's clear you're not particularly welcome. So this is like you've got oases noted in this guidebook.
Exactly, and the book also gave you some warnings about places that were sunset towns. It wasn't a very political book because it was distributed at some mainstream gas stations, but it did give you some tips on what to do and how to stay safe. It listed not only motels, but also places that one could use the restroom or get gas, for example, or stops along the way for your family to enjoy some public lands. It would designate this place is safe for your family. And so you could travel, but it also gave you tips. Before the days of GPS, you could calculate how long it would take you to go from Bloomington, New Orleans to, say, Winslow, Arizona. Would it take you 2 days or 3 days? Many folks that I talked to who used the Green Book would say if they were somewhere, in between towns, and one had to go to the restroom, they would stop on the side of the road, or they would keep driving all night, worried that they were in a sunset town, or worried they would stop at the wrong place. And many times this contributed to accidents because drivers would fall asleep, or they would make themselves vulnerable if they pull over the side of the road to thieves and so forth and so on. So it was even though you were trying to attempt a vacation or some sort of leisure for your family, you were taking a chance.
So is greater knowledge of the Green Book bringing more tourists, more money, more attention to some of these places?
It is. Right now, places like Route 66 and other highways are experiencing efforts for preservation, because what's happening on some of these highways like Route 66 is there's this sense that we're losing something of Americana, that what was once such a central part of this country's history is being gone, is being destroyed because of development, because of changing patterns for motorists. And now, as we go through these preservation efforts, people of color are saying, well, wait a minute, we have a legacy here too. So some of the sites in Albuquerque, New Mexico, for example, that have gotten some preservation money and are being rehabilitated and used for different things, more housing, apartments, or renovated hotels. This history is coming along, and there are various historical groups that are coming together and say, well, let's maybe create a website, or let's do a civil rights tour. If you were coming through my town, here are some places that offered haven for black travelers or Latino travelers. And so that's being part of the history, but it's not as taking off as other preservation efforts, but it is starting to begin to show itself in these various towns.
And so what do you find in Albuquerque, in New Mexico in general, beyond the motel?
Yeah, so beyond the De Anza Motor Lodge, there were other sites that offered protection for black travelers. Hotel Alvarado, for example, and it also had a Fred Harvey restaurant. That building is still standing and is now the train station in Albuquerque, New Mexico, downtown. So the building is standing still. It's a beautiful building. It, for many years, didn't have a lot of use. But now, since the downtown is going through some renovation and some preservation efforts and some construction with a new transit system they have, people are starting to pay attention to this particular building. And as word spreads that this was the spot where reportedly famous jazz singers stopped and stayed when they came to Albuquerque, that it is a place that one could go and feel the experience. Now, there's no signs that say, here's where Miles Davis stopped or here's where Duke Ellington rested. But slowly people are starting to get the information and doing like these side tours and bringing children there and explaining the history of this place. It is located in a part of town where there are a lot of homeless people, where there are a lot of folks suffering from various mental illnesses. So it hasn't garnered as much tourism as some of these folks would like, But as more people learn about this history and other motels, I think that you're going to start to see more of these tours, like Albuquerque experienced when the movie or the TV show, when Breaking Bad started. You started seeing people doing these self-tours themselves. They would do the research and go and drive by various sites from the show. I think you're going to start to see that with the Green Book and Route 66.
And do you see that a specific bump related to the movie, which, other than the title, it kind of just sort of barely grazes the subject?
Yeah, barely grazes the subject, but what's interesting is I started seeing a lot of copies of the Green Book being sold on eBay. I started seeing forums online showing people or informing people how one could get a copy of the Green Book. These are not the original ones, but pretty close to the copy. It looks like somebody copied the original ones and printed out versions, and you can get them relatively cheap, like $5 or $7. And some of the elders that I interviewed in Albuquerque, New Mexico, had already bought a copy. One particular, a longtime civil rights advocate here in Albuquerque, had bought one online, and he said he wanted to buy it to show his grandchildren. And when I talked to him about the Green Book, he opened up and looked at New Mexico, and he was from Hobbs, New Mexico, which is in the southeast part of the state, and talked about some of the businesses that were there when he was a child, and he'd actually participated in sit-ins. And what was triggering his memory is that not only the particular businesses that provided services to black travelers or black residents in that town, but that what the community, was sense of community that built around them facilitated. When after the civil rights movement and desegregation was dismantled, some of these places closed because they weren't either needed or they didn't have the businesses to sustain themselves. So there was a sense of yes, we were integrated, but there's also a sense of loss, what we were losing in some of these places that had developed a character of their own.
Right. It's great. You want to be part of the mainstream. This is what you've been agitating for forever. But then when you get into the mainstream, all of a sudden one discovers that the places that nurtured you when the doors were closed to you, that they end up going begging. Yeah.
And one particular person I talked to said exactly that when they were pushing for integration and just the right to be a human person in the United States and enjoy the rights of everybody else, they would then look and say, well, that hotel that we always stopped in is no longer there. And I used to go and they would feed me a particular dish that I liked, and there were fond memories of a child. But now I can go anywhere I want, theoretically. So there were definitely trade-offs, just like the baseball leagues that were developed in the turn of the century to the 1940s. Once Jackie Robinson broke the color line, there was a sense of loss also.
So last thing, the tourist thing. If I were coming to the Albuquerque area, would Green Book sites sustain a whole visit, or should it be Green Book and Breaking Bad stuff, or lots of other stuff? Obviously, there's plenty of reasons to come to Albuquerque.
If you were coming to Albuquerque and you came during the summer, I would attempt a Green Book tour, but also a Breaking Bad tour, because you could do both in a day or two. There are a number of sites offered by the National Park Service. They list of the Route 66 properties that were in Black Travel guidebooks. None of them are standing besides the De and the Hotel Alvarado. They include addresses, so you can go and to the location. Some of them, as I mentioned before, are car washes or retail stores, but the address is there. You can go and then kind of look and stand around Route 66 or any of the highways and say, okay, I can imagine what this place meant as you were traveling and heading towards Los Angeles or Chicago. But you can also go online with even on the city's of Albuquerque's website and see the sites of Breaking Bad and drive around. So in essence, you can. It goes into this new movement in travel where people are looking for experience and how to gauge and feel a particular tourism adventure, whether we're looking at something vintage or something that you saw on television. And it can be really fulfilling, because when you look at the addresses and you can look at the history of some of these motels and you put it in context, in many ways, not much has changed and some of the aesthetics of the particular town. What has changed are laws, and what has changed is mores, but the environment to which one you could find yourself, you can definitely put yourself back in time.
Russ, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thank you. Enjoyed being on the podcast.
It's Get Outta Here. More on the Green Book after a break.
Download the AP News app for the latest in news, sports, travel, entertainment, and more. Available now for iPhone and iPad.
Welcome back to Get Outta Here. I'm Warren Levinson. For another Green Book story, we checked in with AP Birmingham correspondent Jay Reeves. There's a vacant hotel, the 32-room A.G. Gaston Motel in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, that was once a well-known stop for travelers who used the Green Book. Work is underway to restore it to something approaching its former glory as part of the growing Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument, a monument first designated by the federal government 2 years ago. Jay Reeves fills us in on the history.
There was a black businessman in Alabama in the mid-1950s named A.G. Gaston. He's generally considered at this point to be Alabama's first black millionaire. But in the 50s, he was a businessman. He had various interests, a radio station, an insurance company. In 1954, he opened a motel in downtown Birmingham. It was named the A.G. Gaston Motel. It was intended as a nice place for black travelers to stay. At the time, the city was very segregated. It was known as Bombingham because efforts to integrate were often met with bombs. But Gaston opened this hotel, and it was a nice place. There was a courtyard. It was in the downtown business area that included black businesses. It was a two-story motel. It was a bit unusual for its time in that it had a restaurant and a lounge. And a lot of well-known people stayed there. Aretha Franklin, Harry Belafonte, Duke Ellington, and others. It became a real hub of the black community, and it was located right in the middle of the city of Birmingham's black business district. It later became well known in the 1960s. In 1963, activists locally were trying to build an impetus for desegregation. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. came to town, needed a place to stay. So he stayed in a room at the Gaston Motel. It's room 30. Right now, you'd never know it was anything. It's been... it doesn't look anything like it did then. Originally, they were motel rooms. They were later renovated into apartments, and that's more what it looks like now as an apartment. But King stayed there, and there are very famous pictures from the period of 1963 civil rights protests in Birmingham of King meeting with people in his room at the Gaston Motel. There's photos and film footage of news conference that King and others held in the courtyard of the motel. At one point, the motel actually was bombed while King was staying there after a news conference to announce agreement dealing with desegregation. A bomb went off outside the hotel. King was not injured; he was fine. But that just showed you the kind of animus that existed in the city at the time. That period of 1963, that's where we saw the famous images that exist today of fire hoses being used on black people who were marching outside of 16th Street Baptist Church in a park, just demonstrating for equal rights. Later that year, in September, a bomb went off outside the 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 young black girls were killed. And that church was just one block over from the Gaston Motel.
And what does the place look like now?
But most recently, it's just been sitting vacant. You can tell where people have been staying in there, perhaps climbing over walls, climbing under gates, seeking shelter, but it's just been vacant. Structurally, the building is okay. There's a lot of damage that water's done through leaky roofs, broken windows, doors left open. It is in the process of being renovated. work has actually just begun on the Gaston Motel. It's going to be part of what is called the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. This encompasses the area of downtown Birmingham where the marches were held, where those awful images of fire hoses and police dog came from. But the Gaston Motel, once it is restored to its splendor, what it looked like in the 1950s and 60s, it's going to be a centerpiece of this national monument. It's not open for visitors now, but eventually it will be, and people will be able to come in and see what it looked like, both during King times there, but also when it was featured in the Green Book, that book for black travelers who needed a safe place to stay. I was in the building recently, and crews are there working. Actually, it's a crew from the A.G. Gaston Construction Company, which was one of Mr. Gaston's businesses. And they are doing things like removing later additions to the building. They're shoring up some of the outside masonry. The building is so old, there was cracked masonry, missing masonry. They are trying to secure it so it'll be safe from not being vandalized. One of the things that they are doing is going through plans to determine exactly what the motel would have looked like when King stayed there in 1963. The current configuration of the room where he's believed to have stayed, room 30, it's two different rooms with a bathroom area and what had been a kitchenette during the time the building was used as an apartment. The plan is to remove all the later additions and to put vintage furniture in there with 1960s, 1950s textiles and have it looking as it did when Dr. King might have stayed there. The Gaston Motel is really unique in Birmingham because it was one of the few places where black travelers could stay. As I say, the city was very segregated. Of course, many people moved during the worst of the Jim Crow. It hollowed out the area's population to an extent. But the Gaston Motel was always there for people who needed a place to stay. Right now, there really aren't any other places in the area that are equivalent of this. It is unique unto itself in Birmingham.
Jay Reeves is the Associated Press correspondent in Birmingham, Alabama. He and Russell Contreras, who reports from Albuquerque, are part of the AP's race and ethnicity team. For more background on the Green Book, we'd recommend Yura Barichin's documentary, The Green Book, Guide to Freedom. It's playing on the Smithsonian Channel. And now, my favorite trip. This week, basic and exotic.
I'm about to celebrate my 1-year anniversary with my husband, and on our honeymoon last year we went to Bora Bora, so that didn't suck. It was pretty.
Look like that?
Yeah.
Like the pictures?
Yes, yeah, it looks like a screensaver. That and I'm from Texas, so we would always go to Mexico for vacations. I love Tulum. I basically love anywhere I can sit on my ass and have a cocktail and just unplug.
Same.
Yeah.
Sometimes no phone in the hand, too.
Yes, put it away.
Another country performer, Dylan Scott, reports he's just starting to see the outside world.
Epic. We don't do much epic stuff. My family and I, we go to Orange Beach, Florida. I'm from Louisiana. That's our thing. So this past year I went out to Jamaica. That was fun. I went to the Bahamas. That was fun. So those are pretty epic, right? Come on now. Yeah.
That's really epic.
Yeah.
What did you think?
Oh, I loved it. It was perfect. Yeah.
The AP's Marcella Izaza got us those stories at the iHeartRadio Music Awards in Los Angeles. And that's the show. Get Outta Here is produced by the Associated Press under the supervision of Nikessa Moody and Peter Costanzo. Special thanks to Alicia Rancillo and Beth Harpaz who originated this podcast 2 years ago. We'll see you next time.
This episode of Get Outta Here, the AP Travel Podcast, was sponsored by Carnival Corporation, the world's largest cruise company with 10 of the world's leading brands, including Carnival Cruise Line, Cunard, Holland America Line, Princess Cruises, and Seabourn. To learn about the world's leading cruise lines from Carnival Corporation and great vacation options, contact your travel professional or visit worldsleadingcruiselines.com.